Hello there. Today I'm finishing off my look at the 2025 en-primeur samples that I have to taste. And this is a wine from Pomerol. This is Chateau La Renaissance. So it's an en-primeur bottling of the 2025 of that. So Chateau La Renaissance, not I think a particularly well-known property, covers 6 hectares, which I believe could be in a single block. But at the same time, I've not actually been able to find out exactly where Chateau La Renaissance sits. Something I found suggested that its notable neighbours include Chateau La Consciente, Chateau La Pointe, Chateau La Violette, Chateau La Cabane, and Chateau La Fleur Pétrus. Certainly, all its vineyards sit right in the centre of the plateau of Pomerol. And the vineyards here have a mixture of soils from sandy clay through to some layers of quite pure gravel. So these are quite free-draining soils. And if you triangulate from the neighbours that I've seen listed, that would put the location of this estate somewhere in between Le Pin and Trottoir. I think actually it's probably a little closer to the church, which would mean it's relatively close to its sister estate, Chateau Saint Pierre, which I have already made a tasting video of. Now, both estates are owned by the Pradel de Lavaux family, and I asked Axel, who's the family member who makes these wines, what the differences in soils between the two estates were. He tells me that the soils at Chateau La Renaissance are sandier and more free-draining than those of Chateau Saint Pierre. Something which I suspect could have been quite a problem in the really quite dry conditions for most of the growing season of 2025. Now, as I've described them, the soils here are very classic for Pomerol. The vineyard planting, again, runs along very normal lines for the Pomerol appellation, with 85% of Merlot and 15% of Cabernet Franc. And we're told that those vines are managed both sustainably and quite traditionally. There's an average vine age of 30 to 40 years, so these will be mostly mature vines giving concentrated fruit, so probably relatively well able to handle the quite dry conditions of a fairly arid vintage, such as most of the 2025 growing season proved to be. Everything here is hand harvested, it's gently crushed, and vinification goes on here in small cement tanks. After fermentation, the wine goes into oak barrels to undergo its malolactic conversion, an approach which helps the fruit and the oak aromas and flavours to marry to a greater extent. Now, the oak that is used is French oak. My assumption is that this is 225 litre barriques. There's nothing noted that suggests a different size or type of barrel. 50% of these are new, and the wine will age for 18 months in oak. So this is an en-primeur sample. Won't quite be halfway through that aging process yet. So it's likely to have relatively restrained oak notes at this stage. Now, for 2025, the yields here were 30 hectolitres per hectare, and the blend followed the proportions of planting in the vineyard, with 85% of Merlot and 15% of Cabernet Franc. So this really seems to be a well-located estate on classic Pomerol soils, so potentially a wine offering some fantastic value for money. So let's see what we think of it, shall we? First thing I'd say is that it's a relatively dark, ruby red with a touch of purple at the rim there. It's not all that deep. I can see through it fairly well. As I swirl it, the wine has 13.5% alcohol, and there's enough concentration of tannins and the alcohol for it to just be starting to gently form some tears on the side of the glass there. So a relatively concentrated wine. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas are powerful, opulent. There's a very distinct plumminess to it, a black plum, maybe slightly overripe. There's just some hints of raisin there as well, alongside those very distinct, juicy, ripe black Doris plum, maybe some black cherry notes. There's opulence, there's ripeness, and behind that there's some hints of cedar and some quite distinct, concentrated licoricey notes. So let's have a taste. The wine's medium to full-bodied. It's got quite a rounded, smooth, ripe structure. There's some really lovely, juicy elements to the fruit here. And then they're being followed on by some bitter licorice notes, some quite smooth chocolatey notes, some slightly more bitter coffee notes. Now, given the really quite concentrated licoricey notes that I've talked about, it would be quite easy for this to be a wine that was a bit closed up, but actually there's a lovely freshness that's keeping the black fruit nice and open. There's almost a note of juicy, mouth-watering elderberry fruit, that sort of very concentrated, very fresh black fruit lasting right the way through to the finish. And on the finish, you've got some slight notes of cedar, giving some extra complexity, but actually you've got a long, smooth, quite opulent black fruit finish, perhaps with some notes of black cherry, something a bit fresher and more lively than the black plum fruit we saw on the wine's attack. Personally, I've given this a score of 90 to 91 out of 100. And the more I think about it, the more I think this is probably actually worth 91. There is that liveliness, there's a concentration, there is some complexity as well. I had wondered at first if the fruit was a little straightforward, overly ripe and simple, but I think I am starting to see some slightly more cedary, complex elements just showing themselves quite harmoniously on the finish there. So actually, I do think this is a really nice example of a Pomerol. And I suspect when it's available, we'll find that it's at quite a nice price. So probably a wine that's very well worth looking out for. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the video. And thank you so much to those of you who've been watching my en-primeur videos. I hope they've been of use to you and of interest. If you have the opportunity to press the like button, that would be fantastic. If you'd like to watch more of the en-primeur videos, do on the end screen here, follow the link there to the playlist that has all my en-primeur tastings for this year on that. And there's a link there as well that will take you to the playlist on the Wine Voices channel that will show you some more tastings that I did for winesearcher as well. So please, if you have any friends you think might like to know about this wine or about the playlist, feel free to pass it on to them. And if you have any comments or suggestions or questions, do please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the tastings I'm doing and the wines I'm looking at. So thank you again for joining me, and I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time and come and join me again in the near future for another tasting. Till then, bye for now.